I moved to Franklin almost 40 years ago, and it would have been the end of the 80s probably. I walked into a meeting of Save the Franklin Battlefield, and they said, "You're our new volunteer." So I started volunteering and then came onto the board and then became president for a number of years. And the early days were interesting. I mean, you felt a little bit like the voice in the wilderness because, you know, the story was locally, most people wanted to forget the battle still and put it behind them. And certainly the real estate was becoming more and more expensive, and the building boom had already begun in Franklin. So we started out, and it was a bit of raising awareness. It was a bit of letting people know that this was battlefield. I mean, I think that was probably the major job, and sometimes that involved maybe buying a small piece of property and putting a flag down and just saying, "This is battlefield, folks."
I remember being in Franklin in the mid-90s and standing just south of where the Carter Cotton Gin once stood, where incredibly savage fighting occurred. And I could look to my left and there was, you know, the Pizza Hut that anybody involved with this story remembers. And then to my right, there was all this other nonsense. And then just across the street, which you couldn't really see, was the Carter House. And I remember asking myself, how did this story turn into this? And I didn't have an answer. I thought it was kind of repugnant, actually, to think that the story had been covered up like that. So it was one of the first times I realized that people not caring about history wasn't anything new. The battlefield of Franklin, the fact that much of the ground itself was lost to time is not terribly unique. There were other cities or communities that saw their battlefields gobbled up by time. There were efforts to make it into a national park in the late 19th and early 20th century, but those efforts kind of fizzled out. Congress wouldn't allocate the money. There didn't seem to be a lot of local support because 30 or 40 years had passed and people were just trying to move on. Creating something that we know as a park, which was a pretty novel concept at the time, just didn't have a lot of traction. And then so for 70, 80, 90 years, the battlefield just incrementally was lost as houses and businesses were built on it. In fact, in the early 90s, Congress did a battlefield study, and they classed battlefields, I think, in 4 different categories, and Franklin was in the 4th, which was the bottom. It was said that it was lost. There was no way that the battlefield could ever be saved.
The first piece that we purchased was the property along Lewisburg Pike that has been called a variety of things. It was a portion of Carnton at one time, but it's really where the kind of final approach to the federal line was. It was an important piece of property that men fought across and sheltered under. Initially, people come to the battlefield because maybe they're a military historian, you know, they enjoy military history. They want to see where these troops marched and where these troops fought. Other people go for something a little more rarefied. At Franklin, you see the beginning of the end of the Confederate experiment. You see the waning days of what had happened, and you start seeing an inkling of what maybe is going to happen, which is the country is going to be put back together.
In 2004, Franklin's Charge was formed, and that was a conglomeration of groups like Carter House and Carnton and the Heritage Foundation, the African American Heritage Society, and a whole hodgepodge of other groups that banded together to try and save the last really big section of the battlefield that was untouched. The price was right. It was 112 acres for $5 million. Rod Heller, who's a descendant of the McGavics, and his wife Kay fronted the money and challenged the community to step up and do something more than just talk about it, and the city joined the effort. And so that was the first big victory. And then in the years that followed, there was just a number of smaller tracts, but they were incredibly expensive, closer to Carter House.
The interesting thing about Franklin is the battlefield was lost piecemeal, one small piece at a time, subdivided, given to children to build a house on. As it's come back into a battlefield, it's come back piecemeal. It's a patchwork, and with that patchwork, with enough pieces of that, you can really interpret what happened and really get a feel for the length and breadth of what happened.
The reclamation effort in Franklin is certainly very unique. I don't think there's anything else like it in the country, but I think it has inspired other communities, particularly Fredericksburg, Virginia, which was a lot like Franklin. It had been so lost. I think it's been an inspiration to other communities to save what we can while we can, because the clock is ticking. I mean, the development and the growth and the sprawl that we've seen in the last generation or so isn't going to stop. So we have a limited time to save what we can.
I love watching people look over the fields in amazement that something really did happen here that was that momentous. In another generation or two, I suppose there'll still be young people that are interested in specifics of military history. What regiments fought? Where were they on the battlefield? What did the battle map look like? I think the greater thing will be the people that come, the grandkids and the visitors that come will be probably more interested in the relevancy. Why was this important? Not the detail of it. I think that is going to be the great thing that we can tell them. Why was this more than just a battlefield? What was forged or reforged on these fields that changed the course of American history and maybe world history?
To understand what happened at Franklin, you really have to go to Spring Hill. What happened at Spring Hill was the genesis of the nightmare that unfolded here. And actually, the first big piece of ground saved in this area was in Spring Hill. In the late 90s, Civil War Trust saved almost 100 acres, which became its own battlefield park. And then about 10 years ago, the Civil War Trust saved another almost 90 acres directly north of Rippavilla. And so almost 200 acres of that battlefield have been preserved. And those tracts, or that acreage, and that site, in combination with what has happened in Franklin and Carter House and Carnton, has transformed the visitor experience. I mean, you can actually go to a battlefield park in both towns. Heritage tourism is a boon to the community. I mean, there are tens of thousands of people who come to learn about this last great campaign of the Civil War, and not just to visit old homes, but now they can actually walk on the battlefield. This is a problem that's plagued us for a long time. I personally believe there are more people genuinely invested in the history of this country than ever before. Proof positive is how much battlefield property, Civil War property, now even Revolutionary War property, thanks to the folks at the American Battlefield Trust, than ever before. We're doing things that hadn't been done for 120 years in some cases. That's pretty impressive.
On the fields of the American Civil Wars, you see where things were decided. This country that had been torn apart had the opportunity to see what happens next. And all of Europe was watching what was going to happen. This American experiment in democracy was being viewed by the potentates and kings of Europe. Is this going to work, or is it going to come apart like a $2 watch? Places like the fields at Franklin, it was decided that no, this thing was going to hold together and be greater than it was before.